The courtroom was filled with people, yet an eerie silence hung in the air. All eyes were fixed on the elderly woman sitting at the defendant's table. Her frail hands rested on the polished wood, but there was nothing weak about her presence. She was dressed in a simple yet dignified navy blue suit, her silver hair pulled back in a neat bun. Her face, lined with age, carried a quiet strength, a resilience that most people in the room failed to notice. The judge, a man well into his 60s with a sharp gaze and an air of superiority, adjusted his glasses and leaned slightly forward. His lips curled into a mocking smirk as he addressed her. His voice, thick with condescension, rang out in the silent courtroom. "Do you really think you can defend yourself? An old woman like you?" A few muffled chuckles came from the prosecution side, and the prosecutor himself folded his arms, clearly entertained by the situation. Some members of the audience exchanged uncertain glances, sensing that something about this case was different, but no one dared to speak up. The elderly woman, however, remained utterly still. She did not flinch, did not waver. Instead, she lifted her chin slightly, her piercing gaze fixed on the judge. Then she spoke. Her voice was calm, yet powerful, carrying the weight of something no one in that room had anticipated. She said her full name, articulating each syllable with absolute clarity. The moment her name left her lips, the entire courtroom seemed to shift. It was as if a sudden, invisible force had swept through the room, freezing everyone in place. The smirk vanished from the judge's face, his eyes widening as the color drained from his cheeks. His confident posture stiffened, and for a brief moment it seemed as though he had forgotten how to breathe. The prosecutor, who had been so amused just seconds ago, paled instantly. He sank into his chair, his hands gripping the edges of the table as though the ground beneath him had suddenly become unstable. The whispers began, a low murmur that quickly spread through the spectators, growing in intensity. Who was this woman? Why did her name send shockwaves through the courtroom? Even the bailiffs exchanged uneasy glances, their professional composure faltering. The elderly woman, now the only person in the room who appeared completely in control, let a faint smile cross her lips. She tilted her head slightly, watching the judge's stunned expression with quiet amusement. Then, in the same calm and unwavering tone, she spoke again. "Tell me, Your Honor," she said, her voice slicing through the thick silence like a blade. "Do you still think I am incapable of defending myself? Who was this mysterious woman, and why did her name carry so much weight? What secret did the judge recognize in her identity that made him go pale with fear?" The truth about to be revealed would shake the very foundation of the courtroom. A suffocating silence filled the courtroom, as if the very walls were holding their breath. The judge, who moments ago had been mocking and arrogant, now sat frozen in his chair. His hands, once steady, trembled slightly as he reached for his gavel but hesitated before touching it. His eyes, still locked onto the elderly woman before him, were filled with something between disbelief and fear. The murmurs in the audience grew louder. No one could understand why the judge, a man known for his unwavering authority, looked as though he had just seen a ghost. The prosecutor, still visibly shaken, leaned toward one of his assistants, whispering urgently. His usual confidence had disappeared entirely, replaced by nervous glances at the woman sitting at the defendant's table. Something about her name had flipped the entire dynamic of the case. Reporters sitting in the gallery scrambled to take notes, sensing that they were witnessing something far more significant than an ordinary trial. The tension in the room thickened with each passing second. The elderly woman remained composed, her hands resting gently on the table. She observed the judge's reaction with a calm, knowing expression, as if she had expected this all along. When she finally spoke again, her voice was steady, unwavering. "Your Honor," she said, slowly and deliberately, "I can see that you recognize my name. But do you remember why?" The judge exhaled sharply, his lips parting as if to respond, but no words came. He turned his gaze downward for a brief moment, as if searching for an escape, then finally looked back at her. His throat bobbed as he swallowed hard. The entire courtroom was hanging on his next words, but when he spoke, his voice lacked the authority it once held. This must be a mistake," he muttered. Your name, it can't be." A sharp, dry chuckle escaped the elderly woman's lips. She shook her head, almost pitying him. "Oh, but it is. And you know exactly who I am. You just never expected to see me again." The impact of her words sent another wave of murmurs through the courtroom. The reporters wrote furiously, and even the bailiffs looked tense. Something massive was unfolding, something no one had predicted. The judge, visibly struggling to maintain control, gripped the edges of his desk tightly. His reaction was all the confirmation the courtroom needed. This woman, whoever she was, held a truth that could shake him to his very core. What past connection did the judge have with this woman? Why was he so terrified of her presence? And what revelation was about to unfold that would change the course of the trial forever? The courtroom, once a place of order and procedure, now felt like a pressure cooker about to explode. The weight of anticipation filled the air, pressing down on everyone present. The judge, a man who had spent decades ruling over cases with confidence and authority, now looked like a deer caught in headlights. His hands, which usually gripped the gavel with certainty, now trembled slightly as they rested on the bench. His face, once impassive and unreadable, was betraying his inner turmoil. Beads of sweat formed at his temples, and his throat bobbed as he swallowed hard. The audience watched in stunned silence, waiting for what would come next. The elderly woman sitting at the defendant's table remained calm, unshaken by the power she now wielded. Her piercing eyes never left the judge's face. She sat with an air of quiet confidence, her aged hands folded neatly in front of her, as if she had been waiting for this moment her entire life. And perhaps she had. Her voice, steady but laced with something chillingly deliberate, broke the silence. "You thought you could erase me, didn't you? That you could silence my existence, bury my past, and pretend I never mattered." The judge flinched at her words, his jaw tightening. His fingers twitched as though he wanted to reach for his gavel, to shut her down before she could say more. But he didn't dare. Not yet. He knew that whatever she was about to say next had the power to destroy him. The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably in his seat, glancing between them, his confidence completely shattered. This wasn't a case anymore. This was a confrontation decades in the making. The judge inhaled sharply, trying to reclaim his authority. He cleared his throat, forcing his voice to remain steady. "This courtroom is not a place for personal grievances," he said, though his voice lacked its usual strength. "If you have a legal argument, present it. Otherwise what?" The woman cut him off, her voice sharper now. "You'll rule against me? Condemn me the way you did before?" The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder. Reporters scribbled furiously in their notepads, their cameras clicking away. The jury members exchanged glances, their expressions shifting from curiosity to shock. No one had expected this. No one had foreseen a moment where a judge, one of the most respected figures in the legal system, would be exposed like this, not by another attorney or a piece of damning evidence, but by a seemingly harmless elderly woman. She leaned forward slightly, her eyes narrowing. "Tell me, Your Honor, do you deny knowing me? Do you deny what you did? Or shall I remind everyone here of the truth myself?" The judge's lips parted, but no words came out. His face, once stern and commanding, had lost all its color. He looked like a man standing at the edge of a cliff, realizing there was nowhere left to run. What horrifying secret did this woman know? What could she possibly reveal that had left the judge speechless and the entire courtroom holding its breath? The truth was about to be unveiled, and when it did, it would change everything. The silence in the courtroom was suffocating. The judge, a man once feared for his strict rulings and commanding presence, now looked powerless. His hands, gripping the wooden bench, had turned white at the knuckles. He struggled to maintain composure, but the weight of the elderly woman's words pressed down on him like an unbearable burden. The audience could feel it. Something dark was lurking beneath the surface of this trial, something far more personal than anyone had anticipated. The elderly woman sat still, her posture unwavering, her gaze sharp and unrelenting. Every second of silence from the judge only confirmed what she already knew. She had him cornered, and he knew it. The prosecutor, sensing the shift in power, nervously adjusted his tie and glanced at the judge as if waiting for him to take control. But there was no control left to take. The judge's past had come knocking, and there was nowhere for him to hide. She exhaled slowly, her voice laced with a quiet authority that no one could ignore. "If you won't tell them, then I will." The tension in the room exploded. A chorus of gasps echoed as reporters frantically jotted down notes. The jury leaned forward in their seats, their expressions shifting from curiosity to shock. Even the bailiffs, trained to remain neutral, seemed to hold their breath. The judge clenched his jaw, his face visibly drained of color. "You were the one who signed the order," the woman continued, her tone unwavering. "You condemned me without evidence. You let them take everything from me. My home, my dignity, my freedom. And you never even looked back." The judge's breathing grew shallow, his shoulders slumping under the weight of her words. He tried to speak, but no sound escaped his lips. The courtroom had become a theater, with every person in the audience watching, waiting for his reaction. They needed to hear his response. They needed to know if it was true. The prosecutor hesitated before finally breaking the silence. "Your Honor," he said cautiously, his voice lower than before. "Is there any truth to these claims?" The judge's eyes darted across the room, his mind scrambling for a way out. But there was none. The past had finally caught up to him. The elderly woman leaned in slightly, her voice carrying the final blow. "Justice delayed is justice denied. But not today. Today, everyone will hear the truth. What terrible decision had the judge made in the past? What injustice had this woman suffered at his hands?" The courtroom was on the brink of discovering a secret that could ruin his entire career, and his life. The air in the courtroom was thick with tension. The judge, who had always been the one to dictate the rules, now found himself at the mercy of a woman he had long since forgotten, or had tried to. His throat felt dry, his hands cold despite the sweat forming on his brow. The elderly woman's words echoed in his mind, each syllable striking him like a gavel coming down on his own judgment. The weight of her accusations pressed against his chest, making it difficult to breathe. The prosecutor, who had initially treated this trial as just another case, now found himself entangled in something far bigger. He cleared his throat, trying to regain control of the situation. "Your Honor," he said carefully, his eyes narrowing, "if these claims are untrue, you have the right to refute them. But if there is any truth to them, this court has the right to know." The judge opened his mouth, but nothing came out. His once powerful voice, the voice that had decided the fate of so many, was failing him now. He could feel the courtroom closing in, the walls of justice he had built around himself crumbling. The reporters scribbled frantically, capturing every detail, every reaction. The jury members sat frozen, their expressions unreadable but their eyes filled with curiosity and doubt. The elderly woman took a deep breath, her expression both firm and sorrowful. "You sentenced me without a fair trial. You allowed lies to be spoken as truth. And because of you, I lost everything. I lost years of my life, locked away, knowing I was innocent." A ripple of shock ran through the room. The murmurs grew louder, disbelief spreading like wildfire. The judge's hands tightened into fists, his fingernails pressing into his palms. He shook his head slowly, as if trying to deny the past, to erase it. "I followed the law," he finally managed to say, but his voice was weak. "I did what I thought was right." The elderly woman's lips curled into a bitter smile. "No, Your Honor. You did what was convenient. And now, for the first time, you will be the one judged." What crime had the judge committed against this woman? How had his ruling destroyed her life? The entire courtroom was about to witness the unraveling of a powerful man's past, and the truth that could shatter everything. What would you do if you were in the judge's place? Did he make a mistake or abuse his power? Share your thoughts below. The truth always finds a way to surface. But does he deserve to be judged now? What do you think? Is delayed justice still justice? The judge's fate is in the hands of the court, but we want to know, what would your verdict be? Comment below. The weight of the woman's words settled over the courtroom like a heavy storm cloud. The judge, a man once revered for his unwavering authority, now sat like a prisoner in his own courtroom, trapped by the past he had tried so desperately to forget. His hands gripped the bench as though it was the only thing keeping him upright. The murmurs in the audience had turned into hushed whispers of disbelief, rippling through the room like a silent wave. The elderly woman inhaled deeply, steadying herself. She had waited decades for this moment, not for revenge, but for justice. Her voice remained composed, but the emotion behind it was undeniable. You didn't care about the evidence. You didn't care about the truth. You saw a woman without power, without resources, and you let them take everything from me. You called it justice. But I call it what it really was: corruption. The word hung in the air like an accusation carved in stone. The reporters in the gallery scribbled with renewed urgency, cameras flashing as they captured every moment of the judge's downfall. The jury members sat with rigid backs, their eyes locked onto the trembling man at the bench. He had been the one with the gavel, the one who delivered sentences, but now it was his own actions being judged. The prosecutor, who had remained cautiously silent, finally spoke up. His voice, once filled with certainty, now carried an edge of doubt. "Your Honor, these are serious accusations. If there was a miscarriage of justice under your rulings, this court has the right to investigate. Do you deny these claims?" The judge's lips pressed together in a thin line. His body was rigid, his mind racing. To deny it would mean war with the truth. To admit it would mean the end of everything he had built. His career, his legacy, his entire life, it was all unraveling in front of him. His silence was damning. The elderly woman leaned forward, her voice softer but no less powerful. "You stole years of my life, but you will not steal my voice. I will make sure the world knows what you did." The judge finally exhaled, his head lowering slightly, his shoulders sagging under the crushing weight of guilt. He had been a man of power. Now he was a man exposed. Would the judge confess to his crimes, or would he try to hold on to the last shreds of his power? What had truly happened all those years ago that led to this moment? The courtroom was on the verge of uncovering a truth that could destroy everything. The judge's hands trembled as he clutched the edges of his bench, his breath uneven. The power he once wielded so effortlessly now felt like a distant memory. His authority was slipping through his fingers like sand, and for the first time in his long career, he was not in control. The courtroom, which had always been his domain, now felt like a cage. The elderly woman before him was no longer just a defendant. She was his reckoning. The murmurs in the room grew louder, swelling with curiosity, disbelief, and the scent of long-awaited justice. The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably, glancing between the judge and the woman. He was beginning to realize that this was no ordinary case. This was history unfolding before his eyes. "You still haven't answered me, Your Honor," the elderly woman pressed, her voice sharp yet unwavering. "Do you deny what you did? Do you deny that you sentenced me without cause? Do you deny that you destroyed my life?" The judge's mouth opened, But no words came. His lips moved, his throat worked to form a response, but the weight of the truth pinned him down like a boulder. He knew there was no escape. His silence stretched longer than it should have, and that alone spoke louder than any denial could. The reporters leaned forward, their pens scratching feverishly against their notepads. The jury members watched with wide eyes, their expressions shifting from impartiality to unease. Even the bailiffs, usually stoic and indifferent, exchanged glances. They had seen defendants break down before, but never a judge. Never like this. The elderly woman exhaled slowly, her voice tinged with something close to pity. I spent years in silence, paying for a crime I didn't commit. But today, it is your turn to answer for what you did. Because this time, the gavel won't be in your hands. The judge finally closed his eyes, his shoulders slumping under the crushing weight of guilt. He knew that no matter what he said next, the truth had already been revealed. His past had finally caught up to him, and there was no longer anywhere to run. Would the judge finally confess, or would he try to fight against the inevitable? What would the court do now that the truth had been exposed? The walls were closing in, and the moment of reckoning was near. The courtroom, once a place where the judge reigned supreme, now felt like an arena where his past was about to devour him. His breathing was shallow, his fingers gripping the edges of his bench as if it were the only thing anchoring him to reality. The weight of the accusations, the pressure of so many eyes fixed upon him, the realization that the truth could no longer be avoided, it all pressed down on him with unbearable force. The gavel, which had once symbolized his control, now felt like a meaningless object in his trembling hand. The elderly woman remained poised, unflinching. She had waited too long for this moment to let it slip away. Her expression was unreadable, but her eyes burned with something far stronger than anger. It was justice, long delayed but never forgotten. The entire courtroom could feel it. The power in the room had shifted, and she was the one holding it now. "Say it," she demanded, her voice quiet but sharp as a blade. "Say what you did to me. Say it so everyone here knows the kind of man you truly are." The judge exhaled, his body slumping slightly. His once commanding posture was gone, replaced by something hollow, something broken. He knew that no matter what he said, there was no escaping this. He had spent years building a reputation, years convincing himself that the past would never catch up with him. But it had. And it had arrived in the form of the very woman he had tried to erase. His voice cracked, barely above a whisper. He cleared his throat, but it did nothing to steady him. He looked at the prosecutor, at the jury, at the spectators whose expressions ranged from horror to curiosity. There was no sympathy in the room. No mercy. "I made a mistake." The words hung in the air, thin and weak. A collective murmur spread through the audience, disbelieving, almost insulted by his choice of words. Reporters scrambled to document every moment, cameras flashing, pens scratching furiously against notepads. The prosecutor straightened in his seat, his lips pressed into a thin line. This was not an admission, it was an attempt to soften the truth. And everyone knew it. The elderly woman let out a slow, measured breath, shaking her head. "A mistake?" she repeated, her tone laced with quiet fury. "A mistake is when you spill coffee on a document. A mistake is when you forget someone's name. What you did to me was not a mistake. It was a decision. A deliberate, calculated decision to destroy my life." The judge's shoulders hunched, as if the weight of her words had physically struck him. He wanted to protest, to defend himself, to explain, but he knew there was no explanation that would undo the damage. No words that could erase the years she had lost. The courtroom was silent, waiting. His confession had begun, but it was far from over. Would the judge finally reveal the full truth, or would he continue trying to downplay his crime? The courtroom was on the verge of a revelation that would change everything. The judge sat motionless, his face drained of all color. The weight of his own actions pressed against his chest, suffocating him. He had spent decades hiding behind his authority, believing his decisions would never be questioned, that the past would never return to haunt him. But now, with hundreds of eyes piercing through him like daggers, there was nowhere left to run. The truth, the one thing he had feared the most, was about to be laid bare for all to see. The elderly woman, steady and unwavering, leaned forward slightly, her fingers interlocked as she studied him. She was giving him a chance, one last opportunity to speak, to admit what he had done. But if he didn't, she would do it for him. You still think you can minimize what you did, don't you? You think calling it a mistake will make it sound like an accident. The judge's throat tightened. His hands, which had once delivered countless rulings with confidence, now shook as they rested on the bench. He swallowed hard, his mouth dry. His voice wavered, barely audible. I followed the law. A sharp, bitter laugh escaped the woman's lips. She shook her head, the sound of disbelief echoing through the courtroom. The law? She repeated. No. You followed power. You followed convenience. And because of that, an innocent woman lost everything. The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder. The prosecutor, who had been watching in tense silence, finally spoke up. Your Honor, he said, his voice measured but firm. The defendant has accused you of wrongful sentencing. If you have a defense, you need to present it now. Otherwise... He hesitated, glancing at the jury before turning his eyes back to the judge. Otherwise, we will be forced to acknowledge the implications of your silence. The judge inhaled sharply, his body trembling under the crushing weight of the moment. He had spent his life believing that the law was his shield, that his rulings were beyond reproach. But now, as he sat before the very system he once controlled, he realized something terrifying. Justice was not on his side anymore. The elderly woman's voice was softer now, but it carried more weight than ever. This is your last chance. Tell the truth. Admit what you did. Because whether you do or not, the world is about to find out. The courtroom held its breath. The judge's legacy, his career, his very existence as a figure of justice, everything hung on what he would say next. Would the judge finally break and confess his crime, or would he cling to the last shreds of his authority? The next words out of his mouth could determine his fate forever. The courtroom was silent, yet the tension crackled like a storm about to break. All eyes remained fixed on the judge, watching him struggle against the inevitable. He was a man who had spent his life holding power over others, deciding their fates with a gavel's strike. But now, he was the one being judged. His breath came in uneven gasps, his hands gripping the bench as if it were the only thing keeping him upright. The elderly woman, the one person he had never expected to see again, did not waver. Her gaze was steady, unrelenting. She had waited too long for this moment, suffered too much to let him slip away with a hollow excuse. Her voice, firm yet calm, carried through the courtroom like a final verdict. You can either tell the truth or let history judge you for what you are. But one way or another, the truth will come out today. The judge exhaled sharply, his lips pressing together as he clenched his jaw. His mind raced, grasping for a way out, but deep down, he knew there was none. The evidence wasn't in paperwork or testimonies. It was in his silence, his shaking hands, his pale face. The court had already seen enough. A heavy sigh escaped him, and then, in a voice so fragile it barely seemed like his own, he spoke. I knew you were innocent. The words hung in the air, freezing time itself. Gasps erupted throughout the room, the jury members exchanging stunned glances. Reporters nearly tripped over themselves as they scrambled to write, cameras flashing wildly. Even the prosecutor, who had remained composed up until now, looked momentarily speechless. The elderly woman blinked, her expression unreadable. She had waited so long to hear those words, but now that they were spoken, they felt almost hollow. You knew? Her voice trembled slightly, not with fear, but with the weight of years stolen from her. "And yet, you let it happen?" The judge's throat bobbed as he swallowed hard. His eyes, once filled with authority and self-righteousness, now held only regret. "I was pressured. The case was political. There were people who wanted a conviction, and I gave it to them." He shook his head, as if trying to convince himself that it had been beyond his control. "I told myself it was the right decision, that the law would sort itself out in the end." The elderly woman's hands clenched into fists. "The law?" she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "The law didn't fail me. You did." The weight of her words crushed him. He lowered his head, his body slumping forward as if he had aged decades in mere minutes. The prosecutor turned to the court. "In light of this confession, I motion for an immediate judicial review of this case and an investigation into past wrongful convictions." The judge closed his eyes. He knew what was coming next. His career was over. His legacy was shattered. He would no longer be the one sentencing others. Soon, he would be the one answering for his crimes. The elderly woman rose from her seat, standing tall despite the years that had been stolen from her. She had won, but it was not victory she felt, it was something far more profound. "Justice." As she turned to leave, the last words she spoke echoed through the courtroom. "This is what real justice looks like." And with that, the gavel came down, not in his hand, but against him. The judge had finally admitted his guilt, but was it too late for redemption? Justice had been served, but at what cost? The truth, no matter how long it took, had finally prevailed. If this story kept you hooked from beginning to end, imagine how many more we have to share. Like this video if you believe that justice should always prevail, no matter how long it takes. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of our powerful stories. What did you think of this twist? Share your thoughts in the comments. We love hearing from you. Spread the message by sharing this video with someone who needs to see this lesson.